Ali, for inviting me. This promises to be a really, really interesting day, and I'm here to learn as much as anything else. I need to start with a couple of caveats. One is that I'm no expert on the German context, so I'm going to be really, really interested to hear more about that today. And the second thing is that this is really very much work in progress, in the sense that it's reflections that have occurred to me because of the invitation to speak at this symposium, rather than being a sort of well worked out paper. Okay, so let me just work out how I get to this. Right, so just to give you a bit of the context then of what I'm doing here and the kind of work this comes out of, I've been working for some time with Elizabeth Fraser on broader questions about the relationship between politics and violence, including looking at traditions such as feminism and anarchism as part of that. And what I want to do in these reflections of opening up the seminar today is, following on really from Ali's comments, to take a bit of a step back to look at broader trajectories for conceptualising and enacting resistance in the present. Thinking about how contentions over violence and non-violence, we can see, I think it's very easy to see a particular history that could go back to 19th century anarchism and that could see the same conversation being repeated again and again. But I think maybe that's a little bit too simple, and actually the context within which that discussion happens around violence, non-violence, always starts with a different set of discursive resources, so that even though in some ways we might see ourselves in similar positions to people in 68 or in the earlier 60s, maybe having debates in the civil rights movement in the States between whether or not passive resistance was the right way to go, we can see connections between that and debates that are coming up in relation to the anti-capitalist movement at the moment and to what was going on at the Hamburg anti-G20 protests. On the other hand, it seems to me that the discursive resources available are actually quite distinct in many ways in terms of what's happening now, or at least that there are different nuances to them. And that, again, is one of the reasons why I'm really interested to hear what people have to say about the specifics of the German context and about today as opposed to previously. The other broader context here is thinking about the trope of war, and that obviously came up in Ali's opening comments as well. Militant literally is about war. That's where the word comes from. And I'm extremely interested in how that relationship to the concept of war gets worked through in the way that understandings of militancy are worked and reworked within different generations of resistant activism. And then finally, again referring to something that Ali raised, bringing in the dimension of gender, which I do think does cut very interestingly between the discursive conditions of two kinds of sets of debates I want to talk about. One, going back to Gandhi and his non-violent resistance movement, as opposed to, say, Mao and his understanding of resistance. The context of the 68ers, which heavily influenced, as we just heard, by ideas we now associated with the New Left that become autonomism and so on, that move away from the traditional kind of leftist organised communist politics, but actually in many ways somewhat before feminist arguments and ideas had really got a major hold on leftist politics. Whereas when we're looking at what's going on now, we're in a context in which those discourses have become part of the common sense of the ways in which people are thinking about what they're doing. So I think there's something quite interesting in terms of how that intervention of issues around gender, sexuality, feminism shifts or doesn't shift how militancy can be thought in the current era. So that's sort of broad questions and contexts. I'm influenced to some extent here also by having looked again at Howard Cagill's book on resistance, the philosophy of resistance and what resistance means. And Cagill tells a story in some ways of continuity, which he traces back to Clausewitz's notion of the partisan war the war of resistance, and which he exemplifies as carried through in the work of Gandhi on the one hand and Mao on the other in the 20th century. And for him, what's going on now, things like the protests of the G20, or the book was published in 2013, but it was very much in the context of various kinds of calls for resistance, the anti-capitalist movement, Occupy, all that kind of stuff that it was written. He is suggesting that you can make a strong link between the thinking of resistance that is there in Clausewitz's understanding of partisan warfare, the thinking of resistance that's there in Gandhi and Mao, and then the thinking of resistance that's there in the contemporary era. And in some ways I find his argument quite persuasive and really interesting, and in other ways it does seem to me to be, to some extent, problematic, in part because of the way it carries through the concept of war without, I think, maybe sufficient reflection on what that legacy of thinking about war means. So one of the things that Cable draws attention to at the end of the book when talking about contemporary resistance is a kind of tension in contemporary resistance movements between, if you like, something that looks back to a more organised militant left, to an idea of communism, to an idea of sort of collectivism and collective protest, and a notion of resistance that is more individualised, that is more influenced by situationism, that is more about spontaneity and about different people, as it were, doing their own things, and maybe also more about that personal aspect that Ali raised just now. But he still wants to see these as part of the same phenomenon, that we can think of both of them in terms of that, going back to Clausewitz's tradition for thinking about partisan warfare. One of the things that interests me here is that he suggests we lose the language of revolution with this kind of resistance, a language which was obviously still very powerful when we look at Gandhi and Mao or earlier instantiations of resistance, and talks instead about the way the language of insurrection is used. And this seems to me to be an interesting point, because if you think about militancy in relation to war, you are invoking a strategic mentality, even if it's the one of partisan warfare rather than perhaps of conventional great power warfare. But if you're talking about something that cannot end, that doesn't have a victory, as it were, then to what extent can one continue to think in terms of the vocabulary of war, and to what extent, therefore, does militancy become the appropriate vocabulary to use? That's one of the things that I think it's interesting to think about in terms of where his argument ends up as to where it begins. Okay, so I want to say something now about the question of non-violence as opposed to violence, so kind of coming into the question through that way. It's been, again, a very common experience that where non-violence has been used in resistant movements, critics that are, as it were, maybe in favour of the goals of those movements, always come back to three kinds of problems with non-violence. One is a problem of co-optation. And you can see this in something like Malcolm X's critique of Martin Luther King and passive resistance, and the argument that you are effectively playing into the hands of or supporting the regime of the liberal state through using the techniques of passive resistance. So you end up doing the work of the oppressors for them rather than properly challenging it. But you see it also in things like Gelderloos's arguments around the failure of non-violence within anarchism, as a couple of books that he's obviously produced recently, which essentially say that what you find with those who are committed to non-violence is that they end up policing the demonstration, they end up again doing the work of the authorities for them. And again, that's quite an interesting phenomenon in relation to things that happened in the Hamburg context as well. The other criticism that you get very frequently is hypocrisy, that they're claiming to be non-violent but are actually not. And that partly links to the cooptation point, you know, to the extent that you're reporting people to the police, are you not yourself invoking or enabling violence, even as you're saying you're being non-violent? And then there's plenty of arguments about the way that non-violence, systematic non-violence, depends to some extent upon violence. So, for instance, groups who acted to defend non-violent resistors, to keep the space of non-violent resistors in things like the US civil rights movement and so on. So again, you get the claim of hypocrisy. And then there's the efficacy claim. Non-violence just doesn't work. You know, that comes up a great deal. So that's much more within the sort of language of strategy. Now, all these kind of criticisms of non-violence, problems with non-violence, are bound up with one another. But I think it's the cooptation question that bears most powerfully on the issue of militancy. And here I'm picking up Ali's question really as to what does militancy mean, maybe looking at it with a slightly broader palette. And here again, it's this link to the trope of war that I think is definitive. If you're calling upon the idea of militancy, you are calling upon a set of arguments and metaphors and analogies and images that are to do with war. So if you are being a militant, then you either are or in some sense are like a soldier. And what does that actually mean? And again, I'm looking here at reflections on movements rather than, unlike Ali, I think, who's really talking about what people are saying about themselves now. So, you know, there's a debate to be had here about how useful this is. But in terms of the ways that people present themselves as militants or make that link to the language of war, which obviously happens in non-violent movements as well as in violent ones, then there's a sense that there's solidarity with your fellow fighters, and that seems to me to be extraordinarily important. And I think we see that, you know, see it visually with the Black Bloc, we see it, but also in any kind of mass demonstration or where people are making themselves look alike, interestingly, going back to the clay-covered people at the Hamburg demonstration. So there's a solidarity with those that you're fighting with, and that seems to me to be really important. And obviously a claim about a solidarity with the cause for which, or the people for whom, you are fighting. So you get a kind of friend-enemy logic to some extent, I think, emerging out of the idea of militancy. You are talking about a sort of us-them situation. Obviously the willingness to use violence has been part of the notion of militancy traditionally, although various kinds of non-violent activists attempt to turn that so that that's not necessarily a relationship to militancy. But there's a sense in which there's a kind of, it's perhaps any use of militancy, I think, is parasitic on the strength of that idea that you will use violence, that you will break, that you will hurt, that you will injure. Notions of discipline and of being able to distinguish between good and bad violence. And I love the quote about moral righteousness, because that's absolutely the thing about ways in which any kind of war tends to be justified, is that the good soldiers can identify the difference between innocent victims as opposed to genuine targets. They can discriminate between good and bad violence. So part of that language of militancy, again, it seems to me very importantly, is that you can make that distinction. And again, I think even in non-violent movements that want to adopt militant type languages, the discrimination between good and bad violence or good and bad uses of non-violent force is significant. And then, of course, you've got the strategic aspect of using that militancy language again. So the notion that there can be an outcome, that you know who your enemy is, that there can be some sort of notion of victory. Broadly speaking, I want to suggest in anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist rhetoric today, but also going back in time to 68 and further back, militancy is a code not only for the openness to uses of violence, but more generally for a kind of seriousness of purpose, that genuinely wanting to do the job as opposed to just messing about at doing it. And here I think the relationship between militancy and masculinity is significant, and again that came up in Ali's opening remarks. So when you look at Malcolm X's critique again of the passive resistance movement in the civil rights context, real men don't do that. Real men don't put women in danger. Going back to things like the Birmingham protests and so on. So that the notion of masculinity in many ways played the same coding role within the critique of non-violence in the 60s in the States as the discourse of militancy now. It seems to me plays at least some of the time, or at least that's a hypothesis I'm putting forward, which would be interesting for us to discuss. Okay, so maybe putting a little bit of flesh on the bones of this rather broad sort of mapping out. How have militancy and non-violence been brought together or been pushed apart, as it were, in different contexts? And I wanted to start with Gandhi because, as a lot of recent scholarship on Gandhi has shown, but also as anybody who's actually read Gandhi's texts know, he renders his own non-violence militantly, extremely explicitly. It's the metaphors are about war. The virtues of conduct are very much military virtues. They're about courage. They're about chivalry. So it's a non-violent movement, but he is able to present it, and I think it's important, of course, to understand that this is, about a rhetorical dimension of practical politics in which he's trying to sell a way of doing things to an audience, some of whom, anyway, think that violent resistance is the only way to get the British out of India. So he uses this language of war, this language of militarisation, in order to get these arguments across. And he also uses gendered languages to do it. So classically and famously, there is he tells stories to try and explain what it is that non-violence is about and how it's actually a higher form of courage than actually going out and killing people. And one of the stories or parables is along the lines of you have nasty attacking person X who is coming to try to either rape or kill a woman. The non-violent protester puts himself in the way of harm in order to protect the woman from the violence of the unjustified attacker. And in his discussion of that example, it becomes clear that the height of courage in non-violent resistance for him is for the man to give his life to protect the woman. The height of courage for the woman is to kill herself rather than have her honour disturbed, than to be raped. So there's a very interesting way in which, and again, I'm oversimplifying here, Gandhi's sort of gender politics is amazingly complicated and weird in many ways, but there's a way in which he uses a kind of gendered language to help stabilise and present the militarisation of non-violence and make it appeal to his audience in ways that are common. I mean, whether we like it or not, we're all soaked in languages of war. We all recognise what it means to be courageous and to fight for the right. That's part of the cultures in which pretty much everyone, everywhere is inducted. So he's using that in order to make his argument. And he's using gendered categories to help him do it. So he renders non-violence militant in part through using a gendered language to stabilise the meanings, to stabilise the rhetoric and the discourse. If we look at 68 or at the run-up to 68, again, this is obviously different in different places, and I'm not going to sort of pretend that I can give a general view here. But there's clearly something very interesting going on in terms of the debates around use of non-violent passive resistance type techniques as opposed to the use of violence and engaging in militancy. And here I think we get much more of a sense that there's that non-violence can never be militant enough. And we sort of see that in the critique of the civil rights movement. We see it in the way that various kinds of mass movements and student movements shift as we get into the 70s. And obviously people are going to be talking about things like, Red Army faction and so on later. So it seems that it's more difficult to render non-violence militant within the context of the late 1960s, or at least that there are certain difficulties surrounding it. But to the extent that it's done, I think it is very much done through notions of, again, various kinds of virtues around fortitude, around courage and so on. It's done through notions of mass organisation and discipline as well. So those aspects are very much there for those who are trying to argue that no, non-violence is the way to bring about radical change, is actually the genuinely militant option, if you like, or the genuinely serious option. But that is a position that I think is increasingly destabilised in leftist politics as you get towards the end of the 60s and into the 70s. Not that it goes entirely one way or the other, but that you get a lot of arguments and splits around that. And of course, as I've said already, in the critique of non-violence at that time, again we see gender coming into play. So particularly in the case of the civil rights movement and the Black Power response to the civil rights movement, gender plays a really significant role. So what I want to come to now really is now, and trying to think about, well, what does militancy mean? How do we make non-violent resistance, or how might it be possible to think about non-violent resistance as militant within the present, having just sketched maybe ways in which that was successfully or not so successfully done in previous different places and at different times. And I think, again, we do tend to come back to these three kinds of elements. Organisation and discipline, military virtues and values, strategic success, all of these play into the understanding of what militancy is. And in some cases, some of them are more important than others. So the virtues and values aspect seems to me to speak to the self-militance point that Ali was raising earlier. So, how it is that you render yourself a militant critic through work on the self and through committing yourself to being against certain things. So that seems to me to play a particularly significant role, but there's still these notions of organisation, discipline, who you're with, who you're against, and issues around strategic success that kind of haunt the question of how you might render non-violent resistance militant now. And here, I suppose, I want to sum up what I think are problems with militancy in terms of trying to think about it in the contemporary era. And this goes back to the point where I'm saying that, in a sense, considerations around gender and feminism make a cut between 68 and generations before 68 in thinking about both violence and non-violence. So we have the feminist critique of war talk, which obviously goes way back, which was crucially important to the anti-nuclear movements in the 80s, particularly, and to various kinds of non-violent feminist peace activism, but also more broadly to feminist activism in general. Lots of questioning about the masculinized model of the revolutionary warrior, etc. So you have that coming in the particularly, I would say, in the 80s is the decade where this becomes more and more significant. You've also got, more recently, feminist and anarchist critical engagements with the meaning of violence, so that there's an increasing tendency, and I'm thinking here of people like Gail Deleuze, but also more broadly to be unhappy about the idea that you can make a strict distinction between violence and non-violence anyway. Mm-hmm. That this is actually extremely tricky to do, and that maybe we need to think much more about some kind of continuum, and ideas like diversity of tactics and so on might well fit in with that kind of framework of thinking. And then the other thing that I think has changed is this issue of the possibility of success, of there being any kind of victory or endpoint to resistant practice. And Hegel's point about insurrection rather than revolution being the appropriate term that I raised at the beginning is pertinent here. But also when we think about the resistant phenomena that are currently going on, the huge growth in movements that at least are capable of generating mass demonstrations that have, pulled a lot of support to them over the past sort of 15, 20 years, so going back to the end of the 20th century and the big anti-capitalist protests then. What is success for those movements? What does it mean? Is there any commonality, any agreement about what success means for those movements? And it seems to me all of those three things problematise ways in which both non-violence and violence have been rendered as militant within traditions of resistant practice. So they both all three of them get in the way of us thinking about militancy in perhaps a straightforward, old-fashioned way that we might have thought about it in the past, which, again, it seems to me Ali is capturing really well with that quite complex set of phenomena that one could associate with contemporary militancy. And this is just a couple of quotations from Gelderlis problematising the notion of violence. I think it's interesting in Gelderlis because I completely agree with the way in which he throws the concept of violence up into the air and points out that this is a highly complex and shifting term. But oddly, non-violence becomes completely and utterly rigid in his account, which is a bit peculiar because presumably the two have to be related to each other. So if the one is very loose, then presumably the other is also very loose as well. But this just speaks to the point that I think distinctions that may be felt or experienced as more stable in the past and help to underpin distinctions between militant and non-militant resistant action are now becoming more problematic for contemporary movements, especially those influenced by anarchist ideas. So I'm just ending here with a set of questions, really, and as I say, this is reflections rather than a worked-out set of arguments. So how would one render resistant non-violence militant in an era in which military virtues and values and hierarchical command structures are in question as constitutive of resistance? So to what extent does militancy make sense anymore, given the ways in which resistant forces are self-organising, given actually the huge ongoing influence of various kinds of autonomism, going back to situationist arguments and so on. And then I think that takes us to the second question, which is, how does one render violent resistance militant? So in the same way as there are difficulties for talking about non-violence as militant within this context, it seems to me there's also difficulties in talking about violent resistance as militant in this context. What's the value of the concept of militancy here? What is it doing? How does it change the debate, not change the debate? Is it a return to languages that made sense in anti-colonial and revolutionary contexts in the mid-20th century, but don't necessarily make sense in the same way now? Is it a mark of reaction rather than of resistance? Or is it actually just something that's been re-signified? And I think here this takes us back what for me is a very fundamental question, which is about, again, the concept of war. I'm not sure how you can ever detach the concept of militancy from the concept of war. That's where its meaning comes from. How open is the concept of war to re-signify?